Hey everyone. Quick question before we start. If you were the cavalry commander on the 25th of June, 1876, would you have split your force like Custer did? Why or why not? Drop your reasoning in the comments. I'll pin the strongest arguments. June 25th, 1876. Little Bighorn River, Montana Territory. A summer camp of allied nations stands on wide bends of water and cottonwood shade. Oglala Lakota and Hunkpapa Lakota, and Miniconjou and Sans Arc and Brule have set their circles beside northern Cheyenne Tsitsistas and northern Arapaho Hinonoi. Pony herds graze on the flats. Smoke lifts in thin strands. On the high ground to the east, riders of the Seventh Cavalry move in broken files. George Armstrong Custer rides under orders to find and strike what officials call hostile bands before they scatter. Alfred Terry and John Gibbon advance elsewhere in the theater. The Army believes speed will shock a village into flight. The camp believes families must move first and that ground can be used to slow any charge. Two forms of leadership are present. Sitting Bull is a political and spiritual center whose strength is consent and resolve. Crazy Horse is a fighting leader whose strength is timing and choice of approach. This film asks a narrow and important question. Who planned the stand that brought down Custer? Was there a single architect, or did many leaders act in concert because policy pressure and recent fighting had already taught what to do? The answer matters because Little Bighorn became a lesson written into doctrine and memory. It shaped later campaigns and the lived geography of reservations. It also shaped how the nations tell the story of defense and continuance. Time and place are fixed. The season is dry and warm. The river runs in loops with cut banks and willow bars. Bluffs rise in broken steps. In this ground, a regiment will divide. In this ground, riders from many circles will meet it. What led to this collision, and why did it decide the outcome? The path to Little Bighorn runs through treaty text and gold dust. In 1868 at Fort Laramie, the United States recognized the Great Sioux Reservation west of the Missouri and an unceded hunting range north to the Yellowstone and west toward the Bighorn country. Agency distribution of rations and goods was the federal mechanism. Buffalo remained the real economy for many families. For several years, the arrangement held in part and failed in part. In 1874, an Army expedition reported gold in the Black Hills. Mining camps grew along creeks despite treaty language. Civil officials tried to buy the hills. Lakota leaders refused to sell a sacred center. Through 1875, survey parties and miners kept coming. Game thinned near agencies. Rations were inconsistent. Traders pressed credit. By late 1875, interior officials labeled many off agency and asked war to enforce returns. On 1875 11/3, the government set a firm date. Return to agencies by 1876 1/31 or be treated as hostile. Winter travel for large camps with herds is slow. The deadline converted distance and weather into legal exposure. When the date passed without universal compliance, the Army moved to a campaign. The spring plan had 3 columns. From Fort Fetterman and Point South, General George Crook moved up the Tongue and the Rosebud. From Fort Ellis and the Yellowstone Valley, Colonel John Gibbon advanced east with infantry and cavalry. From Fort Abraham Lincoln, General Alfred Terry moved west with the 7th Cavalry and support. The intended effect was to find a large roaming camp and prevent dispersal. Orders stressed speed and coordination. True coordination over that distance in rough country was hard. Objectives and constraints divided cleanly. The Army sought contact and surrender. It required reconnaissance and concentration. It had cartridge supply in the pack trains and long lines of forage and rations from river depots. It did not know the exact size of the summer camp. Columns moved on separate axes. Telegraph ended at the forts. Couriers carried all updates once in the field. For Lakota, Oglala, Hunkpapa, Miniconjou, Sans Arc Brule, and for northern Cheyenne and northern Arapaho, the near objective was family safety and food. The deeper objective was to avoid permanent enclosure at agencies while buffalo still ran. The constraint was season and numbers. A large camp could protect itself if pressed, but it needed grass water and time to move. Political leadership came through councils and consent. Sitting Bull increased unity by hosting a sun dance in early June. His authority was moral and collective. Fighting leadership came from men with reputations for skill. Crazy Horse was one of these. His authority was immediate and local. On 1876, 617 Crook met an Allied force in the Rosebud Valley. The fight lasted hours over broken ground. Crazy Horse and other leaders pressed attacks that checked Crook. Crook withdrew to Goose Creek. That decision removed a column from the planned junction. It increased confidence inside the summer camp. It taught that dismounted rushes from cover could roll up skirmish lines on bad ground. Terry regrouped at the Yellowstone. Gibbon guarded the lower Bighorn crossings. River steamers brought supplies. Scouts from the Crow and Arapaho nations joined the 7th Cavalry in numbers. Their reports pointed to a very large trail leaving the Rosebud toward the Little Bighorn. Dust columns and heavy pony signs suggested a camp larger than a regiment could stampede by shock. On 1876-621, Terry issued written instructions near the mouth of the Rosebud. Custer was to follow the trail up the Rosebud, then cross to the Little Bighorn and block the lower valley while Gibbon moved down the river. The document allowed discretion if circumstances changed. The practical result was to put weight on Custer's judgment about surprise and the size of the village. Custer pushed for speed. Night marches strained horses. The pack train lagged by necessity. Ammunition resupply was tied to those mules. Scouts at the Crow Nest on 1876-625 saw the valley filled with lodges and advised caution and dawn observation. Reports of discovered trails near the divide arrived. Custer feared the camp might slip away if he delayed. He chose to advance at once. Within the camp, the calculus was different. Morning tasks moved forward. Pony herds went to water. Families prepared to shift for fresh grass upriver. Runners brought word of soldiers on the bluffs. Leaders moved first to secure the routes for non-combatants. Then they gathered riders to meet any attack. The build-up was complete. Policy had set the collision. Distance and decisions fixed the hour. At the mouth of the Rosebud on 1876-621, the paper moment fixes intent. Alfred Terry's instructions direct George Armstrong Custer to move up the Rosebud on the Great Trail, then cross the divide to the Little Bighorn, and bar the lower valley while John Gibbon descends the river. The distance on the map appears short. The country is not. Ridges run like ribs, ravines cut the travel lines, and every mile costs horses and men. The telegraph ends behind them. From this point, messages ride on leather. Custer turns his column south and west into the Rosebud Valley on 622. Scouts from the Crow and Arapaho nations move ahead and on the flanks. They read the trail with practiced eyes. The sign does not taper. It grows. Drag marks of lodge poles score the ground in sets that indicate many circles, not a handful. Fresh dung shows herds in strength. A regiment can ignore a little dust. It cannot ignore a rolling weather of it. The 7th keeps pace, but the pack train laden with ammunition and rations falls back as grades steepen and streams braid into wet crossings. On 623, the command climbs broken benches. The air is thin and hot. Men fill canteens at every seep. The Crow Scouts point to the high lookout called the Crow Nest above the divide to the Little Bighorn. If a dawn view is taken, the valley can be read like a ledger. Custer agrees to send the scouts forward in the night. He presses his main body to a staging draw and orders quiet. He wants surprise at first light. Surprise, however, is a word that requires the enemy to be unaware and to be willing to run. Neither condition will hold. Night 6, 24 to early 6:25. The scouts reach the Crow Nest in darkness. Before sunrise, the light pulls features out of the haze. They see long lines of pony herds and the ghostly geometry of lodges down in the river loops. Thin smoke walks the cottonwood line. It is a big camp. The scouts come down from the ridge to report. Their advice is simple. Look again, in full light. Count the risk. Custer listens, but another report arrives almost at the same time. A small party has likely been seen near the divide. If the village knows soldiers are close, it may break and scatter by mid-morning. The choice hardens around that fear. He will attack at once. The regiment steps off in 3 elements. Reno is ordered to take 3 companies into the valley and charge what he finds. Benteen is sent left to scout broken country and keep the left secure. Custer keeps 5 companies on the bluffs moving downriver along the high shoulders to strike the camp flank or to seize a crossing. McDougal brings the pack train at the best speed mules allow. The spacing that now opens between these elements will shape the day. Inside the camp, the morning is ordinary until it is not. Women tend fires. Boys take ponies to water. Families speak about shifting upriver to fresh grass. A dust line appears along the eastern heights. Runners move through the circles with short calls. Men reach for bridles and quirts and weapons. The first rule is unchanged across nations. Move the families to shelter. The second rule is to find the enemy's shape before the enemy fixes yours. Riders cross the fords wherever banks allow and ghost through willows to mark the threat without giving ground too soon. Organization is not a parade. It is practiced strength at the scale of bands and kin. Reno drops into the open valley grass and deploys a skirmish line near a stand of timber along a bend commonly called Fort A. The line faces west and fires toward dust, where first riders wheel in singles and pairs. Numbers grow. Fire comes from the low swales and from the willow fringe. The river turns the field into a shallow bowl of green with blue sky burning above it. Reno sends for supports and then pulls his line back into the timber. For a time, the wood and the cut bank give cover. Then the pressure increases at once along the edge. The timber cannot be held without ammunition and a stable flank. Reno orders a retreat across the river to reach the bluffs. The retreat is fast and ragged, with men crowding the ford under close fire. Horses fall in the water, files break. On the far bank, survivors scramble up steep earth to the first defensible shoulder. That retreat has 2 immediate effects. In the valley, the camp now understands the enemy is divided, and that one part has recoiled to the heights. On the bluffs, Reno's shaken command requires rally and ammunition to survive the next press. The time it takes to restore order is the time in which Benteen arrives. His scout on the left has shown nothing that threatens the flank. He halts the Panic Alliance companies on the ridge and brings structure back to a fight that had gone liquid. The pack train appears behind, swinging its dust across the skyline. Boxes of carbine rounds begin to move hand to hand. A single voice records the turning of advice into a choice that cannot be reversed. Half Yellowface Scout Account / Crow Nest to Divide Trail, Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876. We looked down and saw many lodges and many horses. I said there are too many for the soldiers. He said we must go fast before they run. I saw that they would not run but would fight us in the hills. Downstream, Custer's 5 companies follow the broken ridge north, searching for a ford that offers cover for a strike into the village flank. The terrain deceives. Spurs run parallel and then end in steep faces above water. In between lie coulees that seem to promise a route and then tighten into rock and brush. Fire flickers from the flats across the water and from small rises beyond it. Each short probe costs horses and time. Each pause on a knoll lifts the command into full view against the sky. The village does not empty out and flee. Families move in streams beneath the cottonwoods, some upriver, some across the bends to sheltering ravines. Riders who have seen Reno driven from the valley now turn their attention to the bluffs to the north. On Reno Hill, the sound begins to change. Firing that had been a wide clatter settles into 2 distinct drums, one close, one farther downriver. Messages come and go. A written plea to hurry with packs and ammunition is shown and argued over, while officers calculate distances and the cost of leaving an exposed force. Benteen's sudden presence has stabilized the hill, but it has also pinned him to its defense. A junction with Custer is now a moving target through enemy-held ground. Choices harden in minutes and then cannot be softened. In the river bottom, opposite the northern bluffs, Lakota and Cheyenne leaders gather riders by signs rather than speeches. Gall measures where the bluecoats are trying to reach the water and directs pressure there to seal the edge. Two Moon keeps Cheyenne groups flowing around the ends of skirmish lines and along the folds that lead toward the higher knobs. Wooden Leg and White Bull recall moving in rushes, dismounting to fire, and remounting to close space when the enemy's line thinned. The river itself becomes a tool. A man who tries to cross it on a blown horse in open daylight will meet fire from two directions. A man who stays on a dry knoll too long will be surrounded by men who know the paths between swales. By mid-afternoon, the pattern of the day is plain even to those who cannot see every piece. The regiment is in 3 parts on 3 problems. Reno and Benteen hold a hill because they must. The pack train brings the only depth of ammunition and cannot be spared from either place. Custer's wing is forward on broken ridge land with water to the west and rising ground to the east. Dust hangs in the heat. The smell of burnt powder gathers in the shallow folds like fog. The noise carries downriver and back again as lines advance and recoil. Inside the camp, the non-combatant movement continues under guard. Children are lifted to faster horses. Elderly relatives are guided along the willow shade to safer bends. Dogs and ponies weave in the confusion and then settle into grooves of habit. The purpose is not to chase. It is to make the enemy pay for reaching too far, while the community remains whole. Lessons from the Rosebud a week earlier are applied without ceremony. Dismounted fire from cover checks skirmish frames. Fast riders probe for the seams between company anchors. When an anchor loosens, pressure increases there until it breaks. By the time the sun tilts west, the incidents have risen to a crest that cannot be lowered. Reno's men will live or die on their hill with Benteen's cartridges and resolve. The pack train will spend itself into that position until the mules carry more dust than rounds. Downstream, the 5 companies will face a concentration that grows with each family safely moved and each rider freed from escort duty. The camp is not an army in the formal sense. It does not need to be. It is a community whose leaders know the ground and the rules that matter when a regiment divides itself under a dry sky with a river at its back. The regiment is now a set of problems, spread across broken ground. In formal order of battle terms, the 7th Cavalry fields 12 companies under George Armstrong Custer with a pack train carrying carbine and revolver ammunition. 3 companies with Marcus Reno have already struck and recoiled from the valley. 3 with Frederick Benteen have come in from the left to stabilize a hill line. 5 with Custer are moving along the high shoulders downstream in search of a ford and a flank. 1 company with Thomas McDougall guards the packs. Carbines are Springfield single shots. Revolvers are Colt. The regiment's depth of fire depends on the mule train and the time it takes to put boxes where they are needed. Across the river, the Allied camp is not a regiment, but it is not unorganized. Lakota riders answer to leaders at the level of bands and respected fighters. Gall of the Hunkpapa and Crow King and Black Moon move men by example and short signals. Oglala groups follow Crazy Horse in fast, low, dismounted rushes from cover. Northern Cheyenne under Two Moon and Wooden Leg, and White Bull cross where banks allow and work the seams of skirmish frames. Northern Arapaho men ride with friends and relatives. The first object remains the same: move families to shelter. Once that is in hand, ride to stop the enemy from fixing a lodgment near the lodges or from joining his scattered parts. Reno's fight has already set the tone. His skirmish line in the valley bent, fell back into the timber, and then broke for the bluffs under close fire. On the first high shoulder, he and Benteen make a perimeter. The line is shallow and the soil is thin, but the hill gives fields of fire and time. When McDougal and the mules arrive, ammunition moves hand to hand. Smoke hangs over the flats. Casualties are stacked behind the crest. There is no plan to advance from this position. The plan is to live on it. Downstream on the bluffs, Custer's 5 companies edge north along a spine that narrows and splits. The first near chance at water is opposite a willow-filled crossing later called Medicine Tail Ford. Men probe toward it and meet fire from the flats and from low rises beyond the channel. The cut banks and the willow shade make a clean charge impossible. Troopers who show themselves on the skyline draw converging fire from both near and far. Custer slides his force along the broken back of the ridge, testing spurs and coulees, looking for a way down that does not feed men into dead ground. A small ford attempt is pushed back. Evidence of that push exists in scattered cartridge cases, and in Cheyenne recollection of seeing bluecoats briefly down near the water before they recoiled to higher ground. The defenders do not chase into a funnel. They use the river line to isolate the attempt, and then turn their pressure back to the ridges where the enemy must stand to survive. At this point, the 5 companies are arranged on a shallow arc of knobs that later carry names fixed by maps and stones. To the south, a low swell later called Calhoun holds Company L. To its north, the ground rises and falls toward a central saddle where Keogh's companies form a frame. Farther north, the last slight rise gathers what remains. On Reno Hill, the sound of this separate fight reaches as alternating drums, first a rush, then a fall, then a faster beat. Messages arrive and are read. One plea for speed in packs is already answered, in fact, because the packs are here. A second note from Custer's direction cannot be obeyed without breaking the only position that holds. Benteen sets his jaw and stays. It is a decision made in light and dust, and it fixes what will happen downriver, whether or not anyone on the hill sees it in time to change it. 2 short voices mark the period when choices harden. Benteen, order note. Reno Hill, Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876. Hold here. Distribute ammunition. Dig if you can. Gall/recall near Medicine. Tail Ford, Little Bighorn. Years later. We saw the soldiers trying to come to the water. We pressed them back and rode to cut them from the hills. At Calhoun's southern knob, the first hard check arrives. Cheyenne and Oglala riders close the distance by using low folds and grass as cover. Dismounted men fire in rushes. Mounted men swing to threaten flanks. The skirmish frame thins. When Company L collapses, the break opens the arc. Pressure then runs like water along the ridge toward the center. Keogh's position tries to hold with horses shot down for a breastwork and men firing from shallow scrapes. Fire from the flats and from the back slope both begin to reach into the knot. Any attempt to move north or back toward the river meets crossfire. Custer's remaining files on the northern rise are in sight of the river but cannot reach it. The path down is raked by rifles from the far bank and by riders who have swung around the spine. Ammunition grows scarce. Some men still have revolvers and make short rushes to break through. Others fall back a few yards to what looks like higher ground, only to find it a false crest. This is not a single circle of men on a perfect hilltop. It is a series of small positions, losing people and room in sequence, until nothing remains to connect them. Casualty ranges can be anchored in records. Official returns and the burial work of the following days record approximately 268 dead across the regiment, with about 210 in the 5 companies under Custer's immediate hand. Wounded, who reached Reno Hill number in the dozens and survive only because the hill holds. Defenders report losses in the dozens with ranges that vary by account and by how injuries are counted. These numbers matter less to the momentum of the afternoon than the fact behind them. Once Calhoun's anchor failed, the arc could be closed by men who knew every fold and swale that led to the ridgeline. Humanitarian outcomes are present in every scene, even when the lens narrows to troopers and riders. While the northern ridges fall, women and children move in streams to protected bends. Older people are led through willow shade to draws cut by spring floods. Fires are banked. Lodges are pulled down, and caches are covered with earth. Where small groups of soldiers are overrun, the fury of close combat brings killings that later memory cannot soften. Where individuals surrender or are found wounded near the end, some are spared and some are not. The field will be read by many who come after, and they will disagree about what mercy could have been given in minutes, where dust and blood erase distance and names. Fact versus folklore needs a clear mark at this point. Later prints and paintings often show Sitting Bull directing companies of riders like a general with a map from a single high point, and they show a neat ring of soldiers firing outward from a perfect knoll. The sources do not support that picture. Sitting Bull's influence on morale and on the decision to gather in large numbers is real. His hand on minute movements in the northern ridges is not proven. The last stand is not one circle. It is a collapse of several groups over yards and minutes on ground that hides as much as it shows. As the sun drops toward the far bluffs, the firing on the northern heights thins and then stops. Riders move among bodies and scattered carbines. A handful of horses with wounds wander along the slope. Cartridge belts and canteens lie where they were pulled or fell. Downriver dust continues to hang over the flats, but the flow of families now bends away to calmer ground. The camp has done what it set out to do once it knew it was truly attacked. It has defended its people and driven off an enemy wing that reached too far. On Reno Hill, the fight is not over. Through late afternoon and into evening, probes push against the perimeter. The men on the crest dig shallow works with knives and spoons and mess tools. Drinking water becomes a problem. Volunteers make runs to a low draw in the dark and bring canteens back under fire. Signals are watched for along the skyline, and none come. The night is a long sequence of calls, false alarms, and short bursts of fire into shadows where grass moves. At first light of the next day, the ground below shows the scattered bodies of horses and men on the northern heights. Smoke from campfires rises far off and then thins. A new dust line appears upriver where John Gibbon's column arrives with Alfred Terry. Relief reaches the hill and moves down to the ridges in slow, careful files. Burial work begins immediately in heat already rising from the dry earth. Positions are read by officers and men who have only partial stories to match to what they see. They write those fragments into reports that will become a record and a set of arguments. One more pair of short statements closes the fighting day and opens the work of explanation. Reno Testimony, Lash, Reno Hill, Little Bighorn, January 1879. I did what I could to hold the position and save the command in my charge. The enemy were in great force. 2 Moon/Recall/Cheyenne. Camp Little Bighorn years later. The soldiers fought hard. We fought to save our people. When they could not get away, they died where they stood. What remains after these movements and words is the shape of the confrontation in plain lines. A regiment divided on bad ground. A community that refused to break. Leadership distributed at the speed of sight lines and kin ties. Fire delivered from cover and from the knowledge of where a coulee runs and where a crest gives nothing back. The campaign that began as a 3-column plan ended in one sharp local decision point where families were almost clear and where 5 companies could neither reach water nor rejoin the rest. That is the confrontation in fact rather than in legend. And it is enough to explain the outcome without adding what the sources cannot carry. The turning point comes in sequence, not in a single trumpet note. Mid-afternoon, June 25, 1876, on the broken ridge between the river flats and the high bluffs, a pair of decisions collide. Custer has divided the regiment to seize shock and speed. The Allied camp has refused to run and has shifted from escorting families to concentrating riders. The ground between Calhoun's low swell and the shallow rise to the north becomes the hinge. When Company L gives way at the southern knob, the arc that holds Custer's wing opens. Dismounted Lakota and Cheyenne rush through the folds of land mount to swing wider and then dismount again to press with fire from cover. The companies on the center spine lose the ability to move or to reach water. What follows is the narrowing of options until none remain. Who and where can be fixed? Calhoun's position falls first. Keogh's frame in the shallow saddle tries to hold with horses down in front and men firing from shallow scrapes. Pressure from the flats reaches in as riders appear behind thin rises that had seemed safe. Farther north, a small rise offers the illusion of a last stand, but gives no real height. Attempts to gain the river are checked by fire from both banks and by riders now across the routes down. The objective for Custer's wing had been a flank strike or a seizure of non-combatants to force a village to submit. The constraints after the southern break are stark. Ammunition is low. Horses are shot or blown. The river is a tool in enemy hands. The bluffs behind are too far and too exposed. The immediate effect is a change in initiative that cannot be reversed. Up to the break, the 5 companies retained the capacity to test fords to slide along the ridge to look for a junction. After the break, they are held to ground chosen by others. The collapse is not one round hill. It is a chain of short fights up a shallow spine, each feeding the next. The human cost is heavy and can be named in outlines that the records allow. Company L's loss at the south pulls the center out of shape and leaves scattered bodies along a narrow saddle. To the north, small groups gather and fall within yards of one another. The number of dead in Custer's immediate command will be recorded at about 210. Among the defenders' losses range in the dozens by account. Names of Lakota and Cheyenne who fell appear in winter counts and later recollections. Their families continue to mark them at community commemorations. An evidence-based counterfactual must be narrow. If Benteen and the packs had reached Custer's line before Calhoun failed, the 5 companies could have formed a deeper ridge defense with ready ammunition and a closer chance at water. A joined front might have held until nightfall, when movement under darkness could alter risk. That scenario required 3 conditions at once: clear knowledge of ground that no one possessed, a free path between enemy concentrations that did not exist, timing within minutes across miles of broken country where messages rode by hand. The record as it stands does not show those conditions met. The clearest admission against interest comes from a veteran officer who studied the field and his own service. Edward S. Godfrey /paper, Fort Custer, Montana, 1892. I think now that the village was vastly underrated and the force divided too freely for the ground. The plan assumed they would run. They did not. This turn is also the return of earlier forces described in the buildup. Policy created the camp size by pushing families off agency with a winter deadline and by failing to prevent miners from entering the Black Hills. Geography created the tactical truth that river loops and broken bluffs favor those who know the paths between them. The fight at the Rosebud 1 week earlier created a living lesson in pressed skirmish lines and dismounted rushes. Each strand threads into the hinge at Calhoun and along the spine. When the 5 companies look for a ford, they meet men who have just proved that standing fast in cover and moving fast between folds breaks open a line held in the open. Names of leaders matter for character, but not for exclusivity of credit. Sitting Bull's role in strengthening resolve through ceremony and counsel is a cause that flows through the day, but is not a hand on each move. Crazy Horse's role in leading fast local attacks is a cause that shows in the shape of pressure at the southern knob and along the spine. Gall's eye for where the enemy must go to drink turns water into a boundary. Two Moon's recollections of riding around skirmish frames and cutting lines into segments match the ground. The result looks coordinated because many practiced leaders reach the same conclusion at the same time on the same map of ridges and fords. Human cost should close the scene. On the northern rise, a few troopers try to make a rush and fall within yards. Others fire revolvers at shapes that appear and vanish in grass. Defenders pull relatives from danger and then return to fire and close again. When firing ends, dust and heat remain. Ponies walk with loose saddles. Carbines lie across sage. Later, officers and scouts from the relief column will walk the ground and trace lines of cartridge cases and bodies into theories. Families in the camp will gather elders and children in shade and count who is gone. The turning point is therefore simple, without being small. 5 companies lose their southern anchor at Calhoun. Ammunition and horses fall together. The path to the river is sealed by men who know its banks and by riders who have the numbers to swing wide. Initiative shifts and does not return. The camp's decision to stand rather than scatter, taught by policy and by a week-old victory, meets a regiment divided by choice. The hinge closes. The battle's outcome follows from that close, more than from any single plan said beforehand by any one name. The morning after the fight, John Gibbon and Alfred Terry reach the field. Men move slowly along the ridges and in the coulees. Burial details begin at once. Notes are made on where companies fell and where horses are found. A few wounded from the hill position are carried down after water is brought up under guard. Officers write first impressions in short lines meant for official reports. These early papers will anchor later arguments, even as their authors admit how little any one witness can see on broken ground. Administration turns quickly from shock to inquiry. In winter of 1879, the Army convenes the Reno Court of Inquiry. Dozens of officers and scouts testify on routes, orders, timings, and what they think they saw. The transcript preserves distances in steps and minutes and preserves contradictions. It stabilizes key facts. Reno fought in the valley, then held the hill. Benteen brought his battalion and the packs and refused to leave the position uncovered. Custer moved downriver along the bluffs and was destroyed near the fords and on the northern ridges. The court does not fix a single blame line. It does preserve a map of decisions that later readers can compare to the field itself. Law and administration widen beyond the court. Through late 1876 and 1877, the Army conducts winter operations to force surrenders. Small groups come in for rations and safety. Larger groups come in as buffalo decline and as patrols close river crossings. The record shows Crazy Horse surrendering in the spring of 1877 near Camp Robinson. He dies there in September after a struggle during a transfer. Accounts disagree on details. The paper trail fixes only the date, the place, and the names of those present. The same season, Sitting Bull leads families north to Canada. He remains there for years. In 1881, he returns to Standing Rock. These movements appear in correspondence between field officers and in entries of the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, which counts people by agency and by ration issue. Reservation boundaries harden during this period. Surveys draw lines that will govern where a school is built, where cattle graze, and where a road may cross. In 1877 and 1878, agreements reduced the Great Sioux Reservation and set distinct agencies such as Standing Rock Cheyenne, River, Lower Brula, and Pine Ridge. The northern plains fill with rail spurs and posts. The Yellowstone Corridor becomes a supply route. The effect on daily life is material and immediate. Rations are issued on fixed days. Beef is weighed and recorded. Children are listed for school placement. The reports of agency superintendents describe weather crops, illness, and attendance. They also record protests and departures to hunt when game sign rises on the edges. Land and resource control follow the boundary lines. Grazing leases and timber contracts appear in agency files. Miners continue to press into the Black Hills despite formal restrictions. By the mid-1880s, federal policy pushes allotment under the Dawes Act. Surveyors pace out parcels and enter names on rolls. The language promises citizenship and self-support through farming. The practice breaks up common use and opens what is called surplus land to outside purchase. The annual report series reads dry on the page. It records miles of fence and numbers of plows. Off the page, the change compresses seasonal movement into smaller spaces and puts cash and debt in place of older exchange. Demography and health shift with the economy. Census schedules list births and deaths. Epidemics are noted in agency letters. Measles, whooping cough, and tuberculosis move through crowded quarters. Food quality varies with freight and policy. When rations are cut or late officials report theft of cattle or short hunts beyond the line. Mission stations and later government schools report attendance and discipline and punish the use of native languages in class. These fragments sit next to each other in the files. A family might show a death from illness in a winter month, and then show a son traveling to a boarding school in the fall. Cultural continuance persists under pressure. Ceremony adapts to new conditions. Councils meet in agency spaces as well as in open country. Ledger artists among the Northern Cheyenne, and among the Lakota record scenes from the campaigns and from daily life on the new grounds. Winter counts add a glyph for the year of the big fight on the greasy grass, and later add signs for the year of new boundaries, the year of the agency school, or the year many cattle died in deep snow. Language remains strong in homes and in camps away from the agency center. In later decades, programs begin to reverse earlier suppression and to teach Lakota and Cheyenne, in classrooms as well as in family circles. Memory of the field itself becomes part of administration. In the years after the battle, officers return to map and mark where men fell. Wooden stakes give way to stones. The ground near the river is known first by Army names and later by the names used by the nations who fought there. In the 20th century, markers for identified Lakota and Cheyenne dead join the white stones for troopers. The site becomes a place where families and visitors read two parallel lines of memory. One is military and speaks of tactics, caution, and loss. One is community and speaks of defense of families and of a river bend that became a proof of continuance. Several records help fix these changes in the mind. The official reports of Terry and Gibbon give the routes, dates, and first burial work, and are among the earliest written frames for the event. The Reno Court of Inquiry transcript preserves testimony that shows how the day divided into Valley Fight Hill Defense and Northern Collapse. The annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for the late 1870s and 1880s record agency populations, ration issues, school counts, and the legal steps of allotment and boundary change. The recollections compiled by Thomas Marquis from Northern Cheyenne. Witnesses and the long narrative recorded by John Stans in Timber carry the eye-level detail that official papers cannot carry. Lakota accounts such as those in interviews with Black Elk and in statements gathered around the families of Gall and Crow King speak to the logic inside the camp. Later field archaeology on cartridge distributions and skirmish lines tests where companies stood and moved and provides a physical check on the words. Together, these sources allow a cautious synthesis without erasing disagreement. The story does not close in 1876. In 1878 and 1879, a group of Northern Cheyenne forced from their homeland in Montana and Dakota to Indian Territory breaks away and moves north. At Fort Robinson in winter, there is a deadly attempt to hold them. The survivors reach the north in the spring. The line that runs from Rosebud to Little Bighorn to Fort Robinson is one of pressure and return. In 1890, a different convergence of policy hunger and belief ends in a mass killing at Wounded Knee near Pine Ridge. That arc lies outside the day of Little Bighorn, but it shows how the lessons and the pressures of the 1870s remain active for years. Present-day nations continue. Oglala Lakota live at Pine Ridge. Hunkpapa Lakota live at Standing Rock. Northern Cheyenne live at Tongue River, also called Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Northern Arapaho live at Wind River in Wyoming, alongside the Eastern Shoshone. Councils govern programs in health education and language. Young speakers rise in immersion schools. Veterans from these nations serve in the armed forces at rates that leave marked lists on community halls. Commemorations at the Little Bighorn Field bring riders and singers from many circles each June. The river still turns in loops with cottonwood shade. Wind still crosses the broken bluffs. The ground holds both the trail of a campaign and the trail of a community that remained whole enough to carry names forward. Assessment of continuance rests on a simple reading of durable facts. A federal campaign found and struck a large summer camp and suffered a defeat on ground it did not fully understand. Law and administration then swept families into fixed places, with schools' rolls and allotments, while the old economy of Buffalo ended. Yet ceremony, leadership, and language endured. The record that proves defeat also proves continuance. It sits in reports and in winter counts at the same time. When we speak the names Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho, we speak living nations that still teach their history and still mark the day when a regiment divided and a camp refused to run. A clear center of agreement has formed across the record. The Allied camp won because it did not break. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho leaders protected families first and then applied force where a divided enemy offered seams. The Rosebud fight 1 week earlier mattered. It taught the value of dismounted rushes from cover and of surrounding skirmish frames on broken ground. Custer's decision to split his regiment without a full measure of numbers and terrain placed 5 companies on exposed ridgeland beyond timely support and short of water. And that exposure decided the course of the afternoon. A second consensus holds on rolls. Sitting Bull's authority flowed from council ceremony and the capacity to gather consent. He raised resolve at a moment when policy pressure and hunger pressed hard. Crazy Horse led in contact, moving men quickly through folds and willows to where pressure would tell. Gall read water and movement and turned the river line into a boundary the enemy could not cross. Two Moon's recollections of cutting skirmish lines into segments describe the logic visible in the field traces. The defense looks coordinated because many practiced leaders made the same decision at the same time with the same ground under their horses. Important disputes remain. The exact timing of Custer's probes toward the river and the sequence of collapses between the southern knob and the northern rise are still argued in studies that weigh testimony against archaeology. The size of the village ranges by source, which shifts how odds are calculated. Popular art often places Sitting Bull as a tactical director on a single high point and fixes the last stand as a neat circle on one hill. Sources do not support those diagrams. The fight on the northern heights ended as a chain of small positions failing in minutes, and tactical control was distributed rather than centralized. The durable legacy runs in 2 lines. For the nations in the camp, Little Bighorn remains a proof that unity of purpose and local leadership can defeat a larger regular force on ground, understood with intimacy. For the Army, the defeat became a lesson in reconnaissance concentration and the cost of dividing command against an enemy whose size and intent are not securely known. In administration, the aftermath showed how one battlefield could accelerate boundary changes, ration regimes, and schools that reshaped daily life. In memory, the same field became a place where winter counts, ledger art, and family commemorations preserve names and meanings. The event endures because it joins a caution against overconfidence to a clear record of community defense on a specific river under a dry sky. The story of Little Bighorn ends here, but the debate never did. In your view, what was decisive terrain, reconnaissance, or community unity? Rank them 1-3 in the comments and tell us why. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep digging into pivotal battles.